All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Danny Wynn. I'm an alcoholic. Um, Karen, we first met, I was somewhere probably in the mid 80s. I know we had seen each other at meetings, but the first time I really remembered having a conversation with you, if you remember, I bought your boat. And that was when we first really met each other, was when that during that transaction, and we got to know each other. And now when I see Karen these days outside of meetings, it's usually we're talking about either our wisteria or our black-eyed Susans or something that we have growing in the yard. So and I've got a couple of her plants out and started out with just a few of them, and now they're filling up a whole flower bed. So that's kind of reminds me of a meeting. You start out with a couple, and after a while, you just kind of fill the room. It's good stuff. This is the first Zoom meeting. Well, actually, I came on last week just to get a sneak preview of what I should expect, but it's the first Zoom meeting that I've been on in quite some time. I lived on Zoom when COVID first hit. I worked in a hospital, so when everybody was being told to stay home, they were telling me you need to get your butt to work. And I worked I had 3 units, 4 units in the hospital that I worked in. I worked at the Cleveland Clinic and at their main campus, and we had a number of units that were all COVID units. So it was, I'd be going to meetings and everything was, stay back 6 feet and wear your mask. And then, seeing people that were still going to meetings and saying, that's all crap, and coming to meetings. And I was just really confused and just thought, what, it's probably safest for me just to stay on these Zoom meetings for a while. And it was so nice to have that, the technology that we were able to do this and to come on this meeting. And I look now and I see there's 109 people on this meeting, and that's great that Zoom is still having that much of an outreach to people and helping us all to stay sober and to keep connected. Um, I my drinking probably wasn't a whole lot different than a lot of people. I used to think that I was unique, but I'm finding that as I hear other people in these rooms, it's really not a whole lot different. I always drank for effect. I started at a young age. I was probably 14 years old when I first started drinking, and it was just pretty much on the weekends. I grew up in Queens, New York, and I had the perfect job for a 14-year-old kid. I was a delivery boy for a liquor store. Back then it was no big deal for the owner to give me a couple bottles of scotch or whatever it was and walking across the street to somebody that had bought it. And but on Friday or Saturday night, if I was going to a high school dance or to a football game, I would tell Bill that I was going, and he would put a bottle of this stuff called Tango in the refrigerator for me. It was a pre-mixed screwdriver, and it was a pint bottle. And between me and one of my buddies, we would drink that. The way we got around in New York was everything was city bus. So we would take the bus to the school and be in the back of the bus, and between the two of us, we would drink that bottle. And it's real important that I remember the way my drinking was back then, because I could have that bottle at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the evening, split it with this guy Jeff, and when the bottle was empty, it was empty, and I didn't have to think about it after that. And it talks about it in the big book that at some point in every alcoholic's drinking that they cross the invisible line. And I don't know when that happened for me, but I just, in looking back, I saw the time as a younger kid where I could drink and set the bottle down, or I can run out and it was no big deal. But by the time that I came into these rooms, there was no running out. And what really saved my life was when I read in the big book. When I got my big book, my sponsor told me, he says, you don't start at page one. He says, you start at the hard cover. You flip that cover and you start reading from that very first page. And it was actually the doctor's opinion that saved my life, because when he talked about when you take a drink of alcohol and he said the alcoholic will, develops the phenomenon of craving. I knew exactly what he was talking about, because once I started drinking, it was I knew I was going to be drinking until I either passed out or was put in a position where I couldn't get any more. Um, that craving would just hit, and I had to have the next one and the next one. So if I only had, if I was staying home one night and I only had a 6 pack of beer, I had the time when I started to the time that I knew I was going to be going to bed, because I couldn't finish that last one and then still be up for another hour or two, because there would just be that craving. I would have to have it timed out it was time to go to bed. And let's see, when I when I was 16 years old, my father came home to us one day. My father worked in Manhattan, and the company that he worked for was bought by a company in Ohio. And he told us that he says, "We're moving to Painesville, Ohio." You know, when you grow up in New York City, Painesville, Ohio doesn't sound real appetizing. But we ended up, yeah, you got that right. But we ended up moving here, and actually, I'm talking to you from the house that I grew up in. I actually bought it from my father 21 years ago, and my wife and I are just getting ready to we're getting it ready to sell. You know, the kids are all grown and they're moved out, and it's just us in this big house, and four of the doors, we have the rooms are closed, so it's time to move on. But I've made this place home. But when I first moved here, you know, it was a culture shock for me being in my came into my junior year of high school, you know, going to high school in Flushing, New York, and now I'm in Mentor, Ohio, going to this high school, and it was a culture shock. I grew up. I have six brothers and sisters, and two of us were. My two sisters were pretty close in age, so we were all at that same school together. And during our lunch break, I didn't want to have anything to do with anybody here. I was just resentful to my father and feeling sorry for myself because now I have to live here. And my sister and I, during our lunch breaks, would go into the library and we would just hang out by ourselves and didn't associate with anybody there. And after about 2 months of that, that got kind of old, and I knew how to make friends. And I stood out in front of the door one morning before school, and I fired up a joint and I started making friends. And we got right back into the same routine that I was doing when I was living in New York. You know, I was pretty much a weekend warrior. Um, I was beer and shots was pretty much what I drank from day one to the time that I came into the fellowship. And so I'd be drinking on the weekends. And when I graduated high school, there was about 2 weeks worth of graduation parties. And when the parties were over, I kept going, and I was a daily drinker until I walked into these rooms some 6 years later. You know, I look back and truly blessed. I'm one of the select that come into these rooms at an early age. I was 23 years old when I went to my first meeting, and I didn't intend to stay sober, but you know, God had other plans for me, and thank God I have not had to pick up a drink since that time. But it was a journey to get here. You know, it was drinking for me. Like I say, it started out being on the weekends, and at some point, I crossed that invisible line where, you know, I would be in a bowling league or something like that, and the guys after bowling would be like, "Hey, let's go to Perkins or Denny's for breakfast," and it was like there was no time for that. I was going to the bar to finish the job that I had started, and and that's, like I say, the phenomenon of craving just started for me. Blackouts were an everyday occurrence. I remember the first one that I ever had, or at least the one that stood out to me, was I was living on the west side of Cleveland, and I was living or I was partying at a bar on the east side, and when the bars closed at 2:30, I drove to the started my journey home to the west side, and I came out of a blackout, getting ready to cross an intersection with a flashing red light, and there was a car crossing, going perpendicular to me. I clipped her in the rear of her car. Her car spun around and it ended up on the side. And the first thing I did when I pulled over to the side, and the first thing I did was take the two empty 8 packs of Little Kings that were in the back, and I tossed them under a bush so that they wouldn't be seen. You know, the cop was waking me up between questions in the back of his car because I kept passing out. And you know, this was 1980. 1980 DUI, or DWI it was called back then, was not as fashionable as it is these days. You know, you get in trouble back then, and sometimes the cop would follow you home, or you know, hey, if you were with somebody, hey, is your buddy good? Is he you okay to drive? And you know, we'll switch seats. You drive him home. But so this cop, he kept me in the back of his car, asking these questions. He made me change the flat tire of the car that I hit, and he let me go. So there was no consequence for me with that one. In fact, the car that I hit also had the same insurance as me, so even the premium was waived for what it cost me for the repairs on the car. But what's scary, and I kept that, I still have the ticket from that. And I look at it every now and again. I go through this folder where I have some things from the past, and it's got some certificates from leads and stuff like that. And I keep it tucked with that because it's a reminder. because the street that I was on, I had never been on before, and to this day, I have no idea how I got on it and why I was heading in the direction that I was, because it was away from where I lived. But like I said, that was the first one that I remember. But blackouts for me became a daily thing. It was, and I was not the kind of I mean, once in a while I would black in and out of a blackout, and I only know that because I remember driving home some nights, having to do this so that I could see just one set of lines on the road instead of the two of them. But most of the time for me, once I went into a blackout, that was it. So I didn't know Karen when I was drinking, but if I did, and I was sitting at a bar at 10 o'clock at night, and I went into a blackout, and she came in at 10:05, we could sit there until 2:30 in the morning having a conversation and cutting up and laughing and joking, and I wouldn't remember any of it the next day. I mean, it was just a complete blank for me. I would only know that she was there because people told me. I had to count on other people to tell me that I had a good time. And but that was, I just thought that was it. I mean, everyone that I knew drank like that. I just assumed that that was just the way it was. You drink, you black out, you deal with the hangover, and you go on. So there were other wrecked cars, and just the blackouts were forever. And I ended up moving back after a while. I had moved out when I was 17. Ended up proving my father right that I wasn't responsible enough to be on my own, and moved back with my tail between my legs. And so now I'm living back at home, and have the same responsibility, just going to work just so that I can put drinks on the table. I wasn't paying any rent or doing anything responsible. It was just all about, well, how am I going to get my next drink? And how am I going to get the money to do that? And that was my goal, was just to get enough. It was easy for me during my drinking to live one day at a time. It was no big deal. I didn't worry about the future, and I just, just enough to get what I needed to get drunk that night. And as long as I can have that, then I was okay. Um, Last couple of months of my drinking or last couple of years rather, was what I really don't ever want to forget, because I'm working in the terminal tower, which is would kind of be like the equivalent of like the Empire State Building to New York, and I'm working in the basement. I'm at a working for a leather shop. They had just started putting a retail mall down in the basement of this place, and all that was down there was that there was a train station, the RTA, Rapid Transit, and a bar called the Choo Choo Lounge. And there was many a day when I would start out my day at 1 o'clock in the afternoon at the old Choo Choo, and then when there was Vincent's Beverage and Grocery was across the hall, and I would go to Vincent's Beverage and Grocery, and I'd get a couple of cans of beer for the drive home, and I would drink those on the way home. And I'd walk into the house through the garage that my mother always kept stocked with beer. And I'd grab a beer or two, and I'd go upstairs, and I'd change out of my work clothes, come down, grab another beer or two, and head out to the bar. If I left one bar to go to another bar, I mean, I was always in the same places. It was the Double J, the Colony Lounge. It was always the same places. So the bartender, I'd say, "Hey, give me one to go," and he'd put it in a bag for me, because even to go from one bar to another, it was like maybe a 10-minute drive. I still had to have, the craving was such that I had to have it. Once I started drinking, it was an insatiable thirst that I just continued to have to drink. And a couple months before I got sober, I remember I got sober in January of my sobriety date is January 27th of 1983. And I got that summer. I'm driving to work one day. It's about a half-hour drive, and it's already about 85 degrees. It's hot. It's humid. You can see there's just like a cloud of haze hanging over the city because of how humid and hot it is. And so I've got all four windows rolled down. That was my air conditioning. And I'm driving to work and just breathing normally. And on this one inhale, it felt like I had breathed in ice. I mean, everything went, it was like it just got real cold. My heart started to palpitate. It started skipping beats, and I just immediately shot over to the side of the freeway. And I'm sitting on the side, on the shoulder, and I'm thinking I'm having a heart attack. So in my best thinking, I took the door and I cracked the door open just a little bit, and I leaned against it in case I had a heart attack. I wanted to fall out where somebody would see me and call an ambulance, rather than fall towards the passenger seat and some just think it's an abandoned car. And I remember the thought when that happened. I see where God, looking back, where he took moments like that where there was just maybe that little gap in my wall where he was able to shoot some honesty through there, because I knew the reason that I was feeling like this was because of my drinking. I knew it. I can still justify it and I was still able to rationalize it. I remember sitting at the bar one night with my friend Annie, and I'm already half in the bag. And Annie used to drink gin and tonic, and they every time they put a straw in, they would have her add she would have them add a straw every time she got the drink added so that she could keep count of how many drinks she had during the night. Okay, that's the people that I drank with. All right, but I'm sitting there one night with her and already drunk, and I said, you know what, Annie? And I said, I think I have a drinking problem. And she says, Danny, we all have drinking problems. And I said, yeah, but I think I'm an alcoholic. And she said, no, you're not. And I was like, phew, thank God, that was all I needed at that point. There were times where it was like, just tell me that I'm okay, then I must be okay. And I was able to rationalize that and just continue on the way I was going. But, but God would take these little moments, and I would see what I was really all about and what my drinking was. And I'd be out with my sister, and she'd get a slow gin fizz, and she's halfway through when I'm on my fourth beer, and I'm like, come on, let me get you another one. Let me get you another one. She's like, Danny, I'm fine. This is okay. I'm okay with what I have. Didn't really care if she drank another. I just wanted her to keep up with me so that I wouldn't look like such a lush, because I saw what I was like. And it happened the same situation with having those that fake heart attack, those anxiety attacks as I know them now, panic attacks, whatever, on the side of the road. It happened again before I ended up getting sober. But when it did happen, was like I said, God was able to get that moment of honesty where it was like, you know what? When I go home tonight, I'm just going to stay home and I'm just going to get a good night's rest, and I know I'll feel better. And I meant that with every fiber of my being until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when I started feeling better. And the Choo Choo Lounge was calling me, and it was, and then I forgot all about that promise that I had made myself that morning. And then there were days just waking up in the morning, I would have to lay in bed for like 10 minutes, 5, 10 minutes before I got out of bed, because if I got up right away, my heart would just was racing. I mean, it would just start to beat real fast. And the only way to make it feel better was whenever I was just standing in an upright, I was always with my arms crossed just to keep that pressure against my chest, just so that I didn't feel that anxiety that was there. And so when it was time, when on the way home, and I'd get that can of beer for the drive home, and I would drink that can of beer, it would that knot in my chest would just start to loosen, and it would just start to unravel a little bit. And I didn't realize it until I got sober, and looking back for a while, was that the anxiety I was getting in my chest was being caused by my drinking, and I was drinking to take away the problems that were being caused by my drinking. That vicious cycle that they talk about in Alcoholics Anonymous, that I knew it was the drinking that was causing it, but it was my answer. Alcohol was my answer for a long time. I believe alcohol kept me sane long enough to get into these rooms, because without alcohol, with this left to its own, it was a sad state of affairs. If I could have stayed drunk all the time, I probably would have never came here. It wasn't the period of drunk that drove me to Alcoholics Anonymous. It was the period of waking up in the morning and being sober and having to make it through the day until I got to the next drink, because the head would start. And it was I'll give you one example of what my drinking did for me. Was when I was working in this terminal tower. I was in the basement, and there was one men's and women's bathroom that was shared by everybody. There wasn't one in the store that I worked at. So if I had to go to the bathroom, I had to leave my store and I had to walk through the food court that was packed with people to get to where the bathroom was. And I was terrorized. It was just the fear of having to do that. There were some days that I stood there, I mean, just having to go to the bathroom so bad, but just having so much fear about walking across the hall to do that. Okay. The same day, I would stop and get those two beers on the way home. I'd get the other beer when I went into the house to go upstairs. I'd go upstairs and I'd get ready to go out. I'd stay home and I'd drink a few more beers. So by this time, I'm starting to feel a buzz. Now, instead of all this fear and anxiety, it's 9, 10 o'clock at night. And I'm thinking, okay, now it's time to walk into the bar, because now I can make an entrance. So alcohol took me from that fearful person during the morning who couldn't even walk across the hallway to use the bathroom, to getting a few beers or a few drinks in me. And now all of a sudden I'm just like, I'm the guy, you know what I mean? I'm the man. And that's what alcohol did for me for a long time. And it just got to a point where Vincent's Beverage and Grocery, where I would stop. I used to drink with the son of the owner, and he disappeared one day for 28 days. And when he came back, he would come over to my store with a cup of coffee in one hand and a powdered donut in the other. And he'd say stupid things like, "Did you see how nice the lake looked when you were coming to work today? You know, and did you see the sunset last night?" And it was just like, who the hell is this guy? And he invited me one Monday. He says, "Why don't he told me that he was going to AA now and that he had gone through treatment. And he said, "Why don't you come to over for dinner on Friday night and we can go to a meeting." I knew his parents pretty well, and he says, "Mom will cook us dinner and we'll go to a meeting." And it was like, I'm also a people pleaser, so in my head I'm thinking, just get the out of here, leave me alone. But it was like, I'll let you know. I'll let you know. Well, I have plans. I might have something to do. And he's like, "Well, one day at a time." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." And but it came down to Friday morning, and he opens the door and he says, "My mother has a plate at the table and she's expecting you to be there." And I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to this meeting. I'll get this guy off my back, and I'll be all right. And I went to this meeting. If you go into meetings, you'll hear often, "Keep coming back. If you haven't heard your story yet, you'll eventually hear it." And God said, "You need yours tonight." And I was blessed enough to have the man. In fact, he's still sober today too, and I still see him once in a while. The man who led my very first AA meeting, he told my story. When he started talking about recovery, he lost me, but it didn't matter because he was talking about the blackouts, and he was talking about once I started drinking, I couldn't stop, and talked about the fear that he had walking across, and just the fear of people. And they had me, and God did something for me that day that I didn't realize until I was sober for quite some time, was that he removed from me the compulsion to drink. He didn't remove the desire. That desire was still there once in a while, but that compulsion that I had to have it, he took that from me after my first meeting. And it gave me enough time where I could start getting into the meetings and start seeing what was going on, and start to learn. And I'd like to say that I got sober and I started going to meetings because I wanted this thing, sobriety. I really didn't. I mean, I kind of did, but I wanted to be liked, and it was like, so I came into these rooms, and I was really upset when I found out there wasn't a president, because I would have run, because I would have had to have had an office or some kind of an official position. But so I'm coming to meetings, and I went from being a bar drinker 7 nights a week to now I'm going to meetings 7 nights a week. Okay, that's a good switch. So I started going to meetings 7 nights a week, and after about 3 months, thought, it's time for me to comment because I know everything. So at 3 months sober, I'm standing up and I'm making these flowery comments, and people were coming up to me after the meeting, going, "Wow, Danny, that was a really nice comment that you had," and the ego is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because I wasn't saying these things because I had anything to share. I was saying them because I wanted you people to know me, and to to like me. And so after this one meeting, I make this comment, and I see my sponsor coming across the hall, and I'm thinking, here comes Larry. He's going to tell me how good my comment was. And Larry says, "Until you're sober a year, or I tell you otherwise, you need to sit down and shut your mouth." And I was like, wow, what happened to keep coming back? And so I started going to different meetings, and I didn't do it to spite him. I did it because it was the only way, again, that I knew how to make people like me. Because when I came into AA, I didn't know who I was. I was just an empty shell of a person that tried to fit the mold that I thought you wanted me to be. I didn't know who I was. I was just I didn't have there was no identity. And so I keep coming to meetings, and I'm doing this. And at about 10 months sober, I and it's really funny. It's not like it came into my mind as a loud question or a loud comment in my head. It came in real quietly, where it was like, maybe you could have a drink. And I was thinking, what am I doing going to AA meetings for the last 10 months? And it was like, group therapy for me was a drive alone in the car, because all the voices would start. And and it was then at that point where I guess I had been restored to sanity enough, like it talks about in step 2, to know that drinking was not a viable option for me anymore. It was still an option, but it wasn't a viable. I knew that. I knew that I was in these rooms and that I was occupying a seat that I needed to be in. And so I started talking to people about what was going on and how I was feeling and everything. And it was like, it was at that point where I had to sit down and shut my mouth and to start, doing things the way they were outlined by people that truly cared about me. My sponsor was, and I say it today, he passed away a number of years ago, but he was my sponsor for probably the first 39 years that I was sober. And I say he was more interested in me staying sober than he was in me liking him, because he told me what I needed to hear, and I've had people tell me, if you always like your sponsor, then maybe you might need a different sponsor, because your sponsor should be telling you some things once in a while that might hurt your feelings, might upset you, because it's what you need to hear. And so I started at some point during this year and a half, where it was grueling. I mean, and I'll tell you, if you're riding a pink cloud, enjoy it. Okay, I did. I rode a pink cloud because I believe, I had been a daily drinker for the last 6 years that I drank. So I truly believe that just putting down the drink was enough of a change in my life to keep me sober, to keep me in the chair that I was in. But it got to a point where after a while, it was like, it just wasn't cutting it anymore. Like, people would come in and I'm dying on the inside, and they're like, "Well, how you doing?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm okay." That coat hanger smile, "I'm okay." And one time I finally got honest with somebody, and he says, "How you doing?" I said, "You know what? I'm really not doing that well." And he said, "Did you take a drink today?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, then you're a success." And I thought, so what? I was more miserable sober than I was when I was drinking. And you can be stark raving sober, and that's what I was. I was occupying a chair in an AA meeting that I wasn't earning, and it was at some point, it's like, if you're standing on a dock and you want to get in the boat and you have one foot on the dock and one on the boat, that boat's going to start to separate. And you need to make a decision which side you're going to jump. And that's where I was in my sobriety. And I knew what alcohol was going to do to me. I remembered the pain. I remembered the heart attacks on the way to work and the freeway and all that stuff. And it was time for me to just buckle down and to really start doing what I needed to do. So I did my third step with my sponsor, which for me was very humbling. You just men, not only do men now pray, they don't pray together. And we were on our way to a meeting one night, and we stopped at a church, and we went into, and we both prayed the third step prayer out loud. And then he told me what it meant to him. And we just shared for a minute, and then went off to a meeting. So I made a decision to turn my life and will over to the care of God, and I didn't know what that meant. And somebody made it very plain to me. He says, he said, if it's hard for you to say life and will, say your wants and your needs. It's pretty much the same thing. Turn your wants and your needs over to God. And so I did my fourth step, because I tried getting into a relationship at 10 months sober. And that was something that was suggested. No serious relationships for the first year. That was what I heard when I came into the rooms. And at the time, I thought, well, that's okay for my sponsor. He's old. He was 50. He's an old man. I'm this young 23-year-old kid, and and he says, well, he said, if you're not going to listen to me about getting into a relationship, he said, at least do your fourth and fifth steps so you know what kind of crap you're taking into the relationship. And that was my motivation for doing my fourth step. But when I wrote it out, he said, when you do this, he said, you write it like nobody else is ever going to see it. He said, nothing but, I mean, it's got to be honest, as honest as you can be. And when I wrote it out, I remember there was one thing, and I literally put a question mark next to it when I wrote it, because it's nobody else's business. You don't need to know this. I don't tell you this. On the outside, on the inside, it's like, if you knew this about me, you would not want to be my friend, because that's how much shame I had about it. And so I went in and I did my fourth step, or my fifth step, with a priest that was also an alcoholic. And first thing he says when I walked in the door, he says, if I haven't heard it, it hasn't been done. And I thought, man, I knew that was God talking to me. And but when I got to that one thing, and I read these things off to him, when I got to that one thing, I jumped over it and I didn't share it with him, and I continued down the list. So even walking out of the rectory that day, I knew that I had skimped on what I was supposed to have done. And it was the first thought in my head every morning when I woke up, and it was the last thought in my head every night before I went to bed at night. You know, On Monday nights, I take the garbage out and I don't lift the lid and reach in and pull out an old chicken bone and bring it back into the house with me. And that's exactly what I did with my fifth step. I brought garbage back and I kept it inside, and it festered for a week until I finally called him on the phone and I shared that one last thing with him. And, it's not like the skies didn't open up and, God didn't throw down lightning bolts, but the, for me anyway, what was the most I got out of my fifth step was that for the first time in my life, there was at least one other person on this planet who knew everything about me that I knew. And it was very freeing to have that. And I think I don't know if that was the goal of it, but that's what happened with me. Um, I went into step six, probably 6 months later. It says in the big book, it says when we do our fifth step, we're to take an hour and we reflect on what we have done to build our recovery to this point. And I wasn't in pain anymore. The pain went away, so I don't have to do anything. I can rest on my laurels, like it talks about in the big book. And that's what I did. I just kind of rested on the work that I had done until my butt got in the corner again, and the head started talking and the fear started to kick in and everything was there. And I knew, step two is telling me if you don't start doing these things, you're going right back to where you came from. And it was time to start advancing with the steps. And I've been able to do that over the years, but it's taken work. I mean, I had to learn the hard way a long time where I'll back off on things because I feel better. And then once I start feeling bad, now it's time to do work again. Now I do the work in advance, and I get the payment that I get the payoff that way too. I went for years where I always prayed since I've been sober. I always prayed in the morning and I always pray at night, but I didn't have time to meditate, and somebody said this comment to me, and I'll ask you to think about this one for a while. It might take a minute to understand what it meant, but he says, if you don't have time to meditate for 15 minutes, you need to meditate for 30 minutes. And it took me a while to understand what he was saying, but I understand that now. And it's like meditation now. It's like I get ready for work and I take, I'll come down, get my coffee, go upstairs, get ready. And now it's, as soon as I'm at the point where I'm ready to walk out the door, I go back upstairs to my room and I take just 15 minutes in a chair, and it's time with me and God. And I do a breathing exercise, and I just um, try to put the thoughts into my head that are conducive with recovery and sobriety. I don't try to think about anything about what I'm going to be doing for the day or any plans or anything like that. I just kind of rehearse just words like love, kindness, forgiveness, understanding, obedience, just words that I believe that are conducive with recovery. And it doesn't make sense to me in the physical realm, but in the spiritual realm, you do stuff like that. And for me anyway, as I go throughout my day, it's like that's the type of thing, that's what I attract, is what I've been spending time in meditation with prayer and with God. And it brings those things into my life. And I do that now on a daily basis, and I've had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. And I used to think, looking for this big spiritual awakening, what's it going to be, and again, no clouds, no lightning bolts. It's the realization that I am not the same person. Excuse me, I'm not the same person that walked through the doors of AA 42 and a half years ago. I'm a completely different person. I don't think the same way. I don't act the same way. And it's just, I look at that person and I know that he could still exist if I ever decide to pick up a drink. I'm not stupid enough. I'm sober for almost 43 years and I go to meetings. All right. I go to meetings because I know I'm not bulletproof and I need these meetings in order to stay sober. But I am not. I'm a far cry from the person that came into these rooms back then. And that's because of people like you who have taken time with me and the 12 steps and a God of my understanding. And with that, I'll shut up. Thank you.